Years and years ago, the namesake of this law school, Antonin Scalia, before he was Justice Scalia, he was, among other things, a law professor and think tank scholar, and edited a magazine called Regulation Magazine. It's still around. Yeah, you can look for it on the magazine rack next to People and Hollywood Reporter and so on. But in early 1980, in 2 issues of 1980, there was a 2-part article in Regulation Magazine by a budding lecturer in public policy at the Kennedy School named Christopher DeMuth. And this article was, the series of articles was a defense of the idea of regulatory budgets. 40 years later, regulatory budgeting is a real fact of administration in the aftermath of Executive Order 13771. And so who better to have on this panel than Christopher DeMuth, as well as other scholars and experts on the regulatory budgeting process. We're grateful to have them all. And to moderate this panel is the Center's Deputy Director, Andrew Closter.
Thanks, Adam. That good introduction, then I guess we'll just get into our panelists. I'll introduce them in order, and then we'll go from there. So our first panelist is Jim Tosey. He's the Managing Director at the Center for Regulatory Effectiveness. He was a long-time career regulatory official through several administrations. He was the Assistant Director of OMB in charge of the Office of Regulatory and Information Policy, which was a precursor to OIRA, and subsequently was appointed as the first Deputy Administrator of OIRA in the Office of Management and Budget. You can find Jim's paper, OIRA Past, Present, and Future, which frames this panel discussion, on our website. Next, we will have Anthony Campo. He's the Director of Government Regulation, and he's counsel at Clark Hill PLC. He also serves as a visiting fellow in regulatory policy at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, he served as Chief of Staff and Counselor at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, for more than 2 years. Our third panelist will be the aforementioned Chris DeMuth, Distinguished Fellow at the Hudson Institute, Distinguished Senior Fellow at our own Gray Center, and he was President of the American Enterprise Institute for a long time, from 1986 to 2008. He is a frequent commenter on regulatory matters, and also served in a few presidential administrations. Our final panelist will be Professor Dick Pierce. He's the Lyle T. Alverson Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. He's a longtime academic with 125, I assume this is not correct by now, but 125 scholarly articles and 20 books on administrative law, which have been widely cited. And he is also a senior fellow at ACUS, the Administrative Conference of the United States. So with that, please, Jim.
Thank you. I think that's on? Okay. Thank you. I appreciate being able to speak with you today, and I'm grateful to the center here for allowing me to speak to you, because if by chance I convince you to take any of my recommendations, this group is a type of group I want to have them implemented. So it's a self-promoting thing for me to get you to help me if I can. Now, at this time of year, people write articles. When I say this time of year, halfway through a presidential administration, people write a number of papers. Some look backwards and say, what did the administration do and what should they do? Some look forward and say, what should their progress be and their programs be in the future? The paper I've written says neither. The paper I've written is aimed strictly at what these other panels said today, which I had no idea they were going to say, is that we got to preserve what we have. And so the paper that I've written gives 3 recommendations and 3 recommendations to preserve what we have. And what I mean by we, I mean the pluralistic we. I mean the people in this room. I mean the predecessors to OIRA and all the people in the government agencies. But collectively, the community has made some big advances, and I want to preserve them. Now, after today, this morning, I heard the red tide is coming into Lake OIRA, so maybe it's more useful than I had anticipated when I wrote the paper. Now, all three sections of the paper recommend executive orders. And let me go through the first two real fast because the third one has to do with a regulatory budget. The first one basically says, I want the National Archivist to look through executive orders and come up and identify certain ones that I would define as iconic. And if you get the iconic label, then there would be a presumption against revocation, a rebuttable presumption against revocation. Now, I want to do that now, not 2 years from now, when there's a change in administration. I want to embark upon this discussion immediately, and I don't want to wait for 2 years. And so that executive order that hopefully somebody will be working on would begin immediately. The second one that I have, the second executive order, is that several years before I entered government service, the Kennedy administration issued an executive order that said OMB was the undisputed person or group in charge of the interagency review of executive orders. And at that point in time, OIRA was not in existence. And I would like that executive order revamped because OIRA is now in existence. And how it happens now, the request comes into the General Counsel of OMB, and there must be a dozen or so different operating units in OMB, and OIRA's comments are just one of 15 or 20. I would like OIRA to have a broader role in that process. Now, let's get to the third one, the least controversial. The regulatory budget. It has a rich history, as Andrew and Chris said. It goes back at least 40 years, and but the issues fundamental to a regulatory budget goes back a lot further, and several principles and several theories predate that and have been around for years. One is the principal agency dilemma, where a principal, such as the president, delegates something to an agent, and the views and process of the principal and what he likes and what he thinks is important is different from the agent. That's very important in a regulatory budget because that's exactly what happens when you do a regulatory budget. There's a principal and sometimes a difference with the agent. The other thing that is new, or not new, that's been around, that these two arguments have not been debated and have not been included in the debate on regulatory budget, is optimal delegation theory. Benji Holstrom got the Nobel Prize. He wrote this paper in '75. And really what that does, there's a lot of axiomatic theory that shows that when you have a principal-agent dilemma, and when you make that transfer or put together the delegation, this is this whole theory of optimal delegation that tells you the ideal systems what to do that. Now, putting through all those models and everything, what comes out of that, and you can read them, they're all referenced in my paper, unequivocally, that bounded institutions, that means when you have a resource allocation system and it's bounded by some numeric total, that the chances and probability of having something more efficient and meet your objective is greatly enhanced. So if you read all that, there's a push towards bonded institutions. Now, I could spend the rest of my last 8 minutes or what I have, how many? 5. Ooh, okay. On that, but I want to move to something else. What I just described was life with a regulatory budget. I want to describe life without a regulatory budget for 5. I'll buy you a drink if you give me 5 minutes. Okay. Now, here's a question to be addressed. How well is centralized regulatory review working in the absence of a regulatory budget? That was some of the issues that were addressed today. Should any, and I think the analytical issue is, you don't put it mathematically, but you can say it, should any and all rules whose benefits exceed their costs as validated by OIRA, should they be issued as final rules? Right now, in other words, right now, that if you're a regulator and you come up and you convince OMB that your benefits exceed the cost, you have a ad infinitum drawing right on de facto taxes to levy on the public. So that's a big prize to get somebody to say the net benefits are positive. Well, other people in the history of these issues address this issue, and we Americans have a nanosecond interest in history, but just give me a minute to tell you what it is. In 1936, the Flood Control Act told the Corps of Engineers you can build any project whose benefits exceed their costs. And in doing so, the Corps came up and started doing very exquisite benefit cost analysis on projects. And it's just like the Corps did them, then they were validated by Secretary of Army's office, and then they were also validated at times by OMB. But they were then, even though it had net benefits positive, they were subject to an appropriation process because the net benefits in themselves didn't bring in funds. Now, here's the point I want to leave you with. Never in my career, until I got into regulatory business, did I ever hear that if net benefits are positive, the project is a go. That's completely new to me for the last 20 years in this field. It's never, and it's not in any other government program I know. You have net benefits are positive, you don't get automatically get appropriation. Now, under what conditions, if the net benefits are positive, would that fulfill another? So the question is, what is the difference between a dam that I have studied here and, how many minutes? 2. Okay, what's the difference between a dam I have studied here and a rule? The dam or the levee has net benefits positive, and so does the rule. Now, if you're a levee or a dam, are there a difference between a levee, dam, and a rule? Well, yeah. One gets benefits from, and emanates from a pile of paper, and the other comes out from a pile of concrete. There's also one is a tax, and one is a de facto tax. So what is this mystique in this business that if you get net benefits, you automatically get to levy a tax? And the only economically way I could make that argument that you have is you would have to consider any rule that has positive net benefits as an entitlement program, because you've met a certain metric and you get automatic de facto tax on the Treasury. So my question is, what does this leave us? If you're of the opinion that positive net benefits is the sole criteria to put a rule in the Federal Register, then you don't like regulatory budget. If you think there's other criteria, there's uncertainties in that, there's a lot of other activities, then I think you should adopt that a benefit cost ratio with positive net benefits is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition for moving forward. And once you get into that condition, you have to rank order and put in together all the regulatory programs of the government together and look at them, and that leads to a benefit, that leads to the need for a regulatory budget. So in summary, in summary, OIRA has paid its dues, but it should graduate from a benefit cost ratio cop to the manager of the regulatory programs of the government. And you don't do that by reading every reg. You look at the entire government, you look at all the rules simultaneously like you do a regular budget, and you look at areas that should be emphasized, and you should look at areas that be de-emphasized. I support benefit cost analysis. I think it should continue, but I think it's moved to an area that's got too high of a burden in the decision process. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Jim. Setting my 10-minute stopwatch here. Thanks very much for having me today. Thanks to Adam and the center, to the center's founder, Judge Rao, my former boss, to its namesake, Ambassador Boyden Gray, and to the distinguished panelists here all those who've come before us, thank you for your service and contributions to the intellectual space and to the practical space of implementing a regulatory budget and reform in our government. I just want to talk briefly about sort of what's happened to date on the regulatory budget under 13771, how that's played out, how we've achieved those results, and sort of the future of what I think is likely over the next couple of years, and then also hit some systemic structural reforms that aren't exactly 13771, but they are, I think, very critical for the future of reg budgeting and regulatory reform. So just in coming to what has happened to date, I guess what I really want to do is kind of hope to clear up some misunderstanding and address some criticism of what has happened. The first thing I think I want to note is that the 2-for-1 executive order is in the context of it. First of all, the president setting out a very clear, what is 2-for-1? It is an executive order from the president. He's saying very clearly he wants reform. So it's not just sort of bubbling up here and there. It's a very clear message from the top that is very useful getting to later on to how this is all implemented. Being able to point to an executive order from the president saying we want this is very helpful in driving change. But that executive order was part of a suite of orders, 13777 that came out as well, directs the regulatory reform task forces to look at not just this executive order from President Trump, but an executive order from Bill Clinton and Barack Obama to work on all three of those orders moving forward to achieve reform. So I think that's good, trying to kind of bridge the political divide there, or make this a collaborative project across administrations. And then specifically about the 2-for-1 executive order, I think it's really important to note that we call it 2-for-1 colloquially. That's how the president talks about it. That's how it generally gets covered in the press. But the executive order has two parts, as all of you know. It has the 2-for-1 part, and then it has the $0 cost cap part. And those two parts really need to be understood to operate together at all times, in all ways. It's essential. And the focus on the two, I think, is where the press has gone. As I've said, there's been some criticism. Well, just before getting to the criticism, just the results. 2017, we announced that the results were 22-1, and then hearing some criticism that, well, some of those are not significant regulatory actions. Others are economically significant. These aren't apples to apples. In 2018, we released a number that is consistent with the methodology from 2017, which was 12-1, but then we also did the apples to apples comparison, and that was 4-1. So even by that extremely conservative methodology, you end up, far surpassing the president's direction in the 2-for-1 executive order. But I think some of the criticisms of the methodology are worth discussing for a little bit. There was as I mentioned, there's some discussion of, well, some of these are not significant regulatory actions on the dereg side, and then on the regulatory side, you have economically significant rules. How can that possibly be? And I think it's important to just think about what the magnitude of what we were trying to tackle. We were trying to change the direction overall of the government, change the flow of regulations in a very significant, fundamental way, and that is not an easy thing to do, as you can imagine. And so the reason that the guidance that we issued provides more flexibility on that front is really to try to get at all the small things that maybe would otherwise just be left in place because they don't outweigh a large economically significant rule. It's important. There was one letter sent out from DOI that said you can't use lead sinkers on your fishing lines and lead ammo in your guns when you're hunting on federal lands. So there's no cost-benefit analysis in that prior letter from the last administration. Pulling it back doesn't result in any cost savings. But that's the sort of thing that, should we just leave it on the books because it doesn't offset a massive economically significant rule? Maybe not, probably not. And so we tried to create a system that encourages a kind of cultural shift within the agency to look for low-hanging fruit, to look for sort of mid-sized things. A lot of those actions as you know, they don't have cost benefit analysis in them. They're guidance documents, they're notices, and all of it has real world effects. And so trying to create some sort of a mechanism to capture and reward what was seen as good behavior in that area, I think makes a lot of sense. And if there's a criticism that, well, that can be gamed or something, that's where the $0 cost cap comes in and is hard and fixed and very difficult to avoid. And so those two pieces work in tandem. And just on that score, the cost caps, I think it's important just to emphasize, because again, most of the reporting that comes out on this is about the 2-for-1 number, because that's what we like to talk about. But the $0 cost cap, the president said no net new regulatory costs, and 2 years in a row, the government has produced no net new regulatory costs. I mean, this is extraordinary, and I don't think many people thought at all that we could achieve that. And I think the way, in large part, that it was achieved was having the flexibility on the two side to encourage good behavior and sort of try to change the mindset from thinking always pro-regulatory to thinking more pro-regulatory reform, and what are all the various things that we can do, whether it's information collections or notices or letters, what are all the things that we can do to get credit in this new system. So I think it's an interesting, sophisticated system, actually, that has produced results. So it's not just $0 of total net new cost, but also almost all agencies are in compliance. I mean, this is also extraordinary. It's not like half the agencies are not in compliance and a few are doing good and they're offsetting. Like almost everyone is in compliance for the whole run of the administration. That also is extraordinary. And the savings there, 10 billion net savings, present savings, 23 billion net savings in 2018, and we'll find out soon enough, I'm sure, for 2019 what the numbers are. But 2 years in a row on the budget side, on the cost side, of hitting and exceeding the president's goal. As to how this got done, I think it's just quickly, so we built on a lot of existing mechanisms. So obviously the ordinary review process, the unified agenda, and I guess one part of the unified agenda that's we've talked about, it's been talked about a little bit, but I think it's worth kind of underscoring here. There was, in the process of putting out the first unified agenda, it was the first agenda of the Trump administration. We're pulling together all the numbers, and there was a point at which we had a set of numbers that looked beautiful. They were perfect, they were great. But then we saw another list over here that was really long, and it had lots of stuff on it that I thought people probably wouldn't like, and we were wondering what is this list over here. And a report from ACUS was brought to our attention, highlighting the creation of this pending action list in the Obama administration, which is a non-public list of rules in the pipeline. It was almost 700 rules when the president was inaugurated. When he took office, and that list swelled in the 2-for-1 first review process, and Mick has talked about this publicly. So, but it's important to know. I mean, that we saw that growing, and we said, well, we're not trying to make it look like we're doing a good job. We're trying to actually do a good job. We're trying to actually deliver on reforms that the president campaigned on and has talked about widely, and so. While maybe some people think it's a small thing, it's the unified agenda, who cares? It's not really regulations. We wanted the agenda to reflect the agenda of the president and the administration, and to not have sort of hidden all the other stuff that doesn't maybe look so good. So that was when Mick and others made the decision to make that list public. And we said to the agencies, everything that's anywhere in the GSA system is going to be public. So you need to be prepared to own it and support it, and somewhere, and it's not, I don't think it's any particular person's fault. It's the beginning of administration. There were not a lot of people there waiting for people to be confirmed by the Senate, in many cases still waiting. But it was important to have, once we decided to make that list public, that is when almost overnight, agencies started paying a lot more attention to the list. And a lot of regulations came off, as has been noted. Some 1,500 regulations in that pipeline were removed from the pipeline or delayed in it. And that's just one initial step that just started to send, again, a message, part of a sort of confluence of factors here. It's not, no one thing leads to the results that were achieved, but that is one sort of thing that contributed positively to that. Getting rid of the pending list. Also just building off of existing mechanisms, the Paperwork Reduction Act, the Congressional Review Act, the Reg Flex Act, all of those existing mechanisms provided a lot of ways to get at rules and make changes consistent with the budget. And then I know I'm out of time here, so just one final note on this kind of structural reforms that I think are really important. The new review process for Treasury rules is enormously important, and I think is likely to be a long-term reform that will benefit the public much as OIRA review and all other areas benefits the public and the production and the quality of the rulemaking process. And then as to the future, I think just quickly, in the beginning, we obviously went at that low-hanging fruit, as I was talking about, and we sort of had a phase of year one of getting rid of a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and then starting to propose in the next year a lot of rules, and now we're getting to the point where those rules are starting to be finalized. So criticism of court, what has played out in court in some cases is largely around early delay rules that were not the sort of substantive rewrites. Those are just going out now. As you've seen, ESA reforms just went out, Clean Power Plan's out. So all those kind of larger reforms are underway and are just now coming out. And I think we're just about to start seeing the benefits of the larger regulatory reform program now, and maybe other things in the pipeline that we'll be talking about in the near future. But that's all for now. Thank you very much.
Chris?
My next?
Yep.
I thought you were next. No, you're next. Oh, okay. Okay, here it goes.
Then I get to criticize you. And then can-
Yeah, no, I want him to go first.
Do rock, paper, scissors.
Jim Tosey is an institutional economist, capital I, capital E. He is an activist, Douglas North, par excellence. He, like Susan and Stuart this morning, is impressed by the durability of the White House review and cost-benefit standard programs, but he wants to embed them in institutions to fortify OIRA as an institution, the executive orders that we have, and he has some highly imaginative ideas for doing it. I knew Jim as an institution builder when we were working together at OIRA in the first Reagan term. Sometimes he would brief me on something, and I would say, Jim, can we do that? And he would say, we already have. So I asked him this morning, does the National Archives have an executive order, iconic order program? And he said, it does now. So he's got that idea. He wants to expand OIRA's formal role in the issuance of executive orders. All of these are to bolster, fortify it over time. He gives us an institutional history of cost-benefit analysis in the Executive Office of the President. He points out, and his institutional history really complements Susan Dudley's, I think, very nicely. He points out that in the 1970s, the idea of a regulatory budget was kicking around at the time that the institutions and the presidents, as they came in, had a decision to make and went with cost-benefit analysis. He thinks that after several decades of learning, it is good to move on to a more constraining program, and that is a regulatory budget. I think it's quite a valuable contribution that Jim has made, that we should think about these problems as problems of the principal agent problems in the context of a large institution, a problem that exists in severe form in regulatory policy, where you have mission-oriented agencies with power to order very large private expenditures on behalf of their mission. They will, if left to their own devices, order expenditures that take too little account of competing demands on resources. Some form of constraint is appropriate. And he makes, I think, a very powerful case that benefit cost analysis is not sufficient. There's a big contribution in this paper simply to call attention to Yair Listokin's paper in the Yale Law Journal, Bounded Institutions, of a couple of years ago. It was published in 2014. I think it's the most important intellectual contribution on the issue of the management of regulatory policy that has come along in many decades. It is not an advocacy piece, it's analytical. It points out the advantages and limitations of what would be, in the context of regulatory policy, a regulatory budget. It points out that an institution that is bounded, as he said, is constrained, can actually be decentralizing rather than calling on the agencies to have the decisions centralized somewhat in the office of the president. It relies on their incentives within a budget to make choices that will be on net beneficial. It is not without costs. There are benefits and disadvantages to both, but it adds up to a powerful support for the ideas of people that want to take this next step. Why was it that cost-benefit was chosen? I think part of it, Jim points out that there were economists that had been working in the government on public works projects. People were starting to say that we should apply benefit cost analysis extended from public works projects to regulation. There was something else. There was discussion of the idea of informal versus formalized benefit cost analysis. When very, very busy political officials at a senior level in the White House hear that something is up at some agency around town, they're getting complaints from people in Congress or from supporters of the administration, and you have 5 minutes with the chief of staff or deputy chief of staff at the White House. That person wants to know, what are these guys up to anyway? How much is it going to cost? Why do they think it's a good idea? Do we think it's a good idea? And we're getting all these complaints. Is there anything we can do to make it a better decision? That's an informal benefit. It is a reporting mechanism from the agent to the principal. And through the various programs in the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations, it came to be somewhat more formalized through the processes that Susan and Jim talk about, and it was the natural next step when the Reagan people came to town. It has been durable, to extend what I said this morning, because cost-benefit analysis is a constraint, but it is a very elastic constraint, as Jim points out. Benefit cost analysis, it's a decision-making tool. It is not an economizing tool. The number of things that can be done in the world that pass a benefit cost test is infinite. You can justify anything. That doesn't mean that we can go ahead and do everything that consumes resources today simply because there's a good chance that using these resources would produce a good thing. So it is a very elastic constraint, and I think Dick I think that his paper that he's going to explain, it's a little bit waggish, but he's saying, well, if we're going to have a regulatory budget, given the fabulous benefits that government regulation has produced over the years, as documented by Sally and Susan and Kristen Muth and all of these people, fabulous benefits. As I read him, I think that his regulatory budget would be several $1 trillion. He can elaborate on it, but it should be a massive budget, probably higher than the 4.7 trillion expenditure budget we are laboring under today. And he thinks that this expansion of the regulatory state would clearly be beneficial. I think it would be difficult for a president to come in and say, we're going for another $4 trillion of regulatory expenses. It would be politically a difficult thing to make, but it illustrates the idea that benefit cost analysis is actually a powerful tool of imagining and justifying regulatory growth. The efforts that we've just been told about to institute a regulatory budget, it's clearly still a work in process. It has not resulted in dramatic reductions, taking rules off the book. It could not have so far. It has not been a binding constraint because there's been so little new regulatory activity. Some people are worrying that the administration may not meet its budget goals it's got 2 weeks to go for this fiscal year. We will see. It is being developed, and it is hard to see exactly how it is going to shake out, whether they can make additional progress. Most of the rules that have been relaxed or changed have been high profile ones, the Clean Power Plan, Waters of the United States, the discretionary bans of incandescent light bulbs, the fiduciary rule, the guidance on sexual assault procedures on campus. The interesting thing will be in the next year or so, especially if the administration, as most administrations do, becomes more pro-regulatory over time. So they have their bump stock rule. Now they're going to ban vaping. Presidents start to do things, and these things will be very costly. To implement them is going to require digging more deeply into the installed base of regulation than we have seen so far. Without prejudging how any of that might go, I would like to make some suggestions for what OIRA could do in the meantime, which would both fortify the benefit cost standard and, I believe, pave the way for the more ambitious and comprehensive idea of a regulatory budget. The first, which I mentioned this morning, is OIRA should simply have on its website a place where you can go and get all of the regulatory impact analyses that are being done in all of the regulations. I want to tie, I want to make it clear that OIRA's raison d'etre is the integrity of benefit cost analyses and how good a job the agency is doing. Everybody wants to avoid it. OIRA is really about improved information. We were told at lunch, actually, OIRA is about democratic accountability. That's all fine. OIRA is about making regulations more cost beneficial. I want to tie OIRA to the mast and not let them put that like 10th on the list of the nice things that they're doing for the American government. Having these things front and center, right at the top of the OIRA website, would facilitate the sort of criticism that we've had on some rules here today, and develop this central part of what OIRA does. I would like to eliminate the distinction, I can't even figure out where it came from, between a regulatory action and a deregulatory action. This turns out in practice to be filled with metaphysical dilemmas. The administration had to impose a new labeling rule for bioengineered foods. Congress told them to do it. They did it. It's going to cost a lot of money to comply with these new labeling regulations. The Agriculture Department concluded that the benefits would be zero. But it also concluded that if it didn't do this, the state of Vermont, which already has a much tougher Ben & Jerry's bioengineered food labeling program, would probably be followed nationally, so they actually called it deregulatory. It doesn't make any difference. You got a 2 out and 1 in rule. You abolish a rule, you add a rule. There are costs and benefits to those actions. You don't need to spend a lot of time, and there's an enormous amount of time. In the papers we have today, on the websites, is this a regulatory action or is it a deregulatory action? It's an action. We abolished a rule or we added a rule, and it has costs and benefits, and we can do without that. I think that OIRA should have a general counsel. When I was there, we had some terrific high-powered lawyering at the beginning. Cass Sunstein over at the Justice Department was involved in drafting 12291. We had Boyden Gray. We had Mike McConnell at OMB. And we've had several lawyers. The current acting that we heard from, he went to law school. But these regulatory issues, as we've seen in almost everything we've discussed today, the economic issues and the legal issues are increasingly intertwined, and I believe that OIRA itself has to have a stable of lawyers that are there year in and year out, that have seen these issues go, that can help avoid there have been several unforced errors in legal unforced errors in this administration so far. OIRA ought to have been able to have caught them. But most of all, I think that is important for implementing the Noe-Graham program. It's not just sending an order out to the agencies saying maximize your discretion to consider benefits and costs in individual rules. This is going to require a lot of peacemake from regulation and statute to regulation and statute, and I think that needs to be done internally in OIRA. The Supreme Court took the unusual step of staying the Clean Water Act rule because it was very suspicious about it. I think that the idea that the executive branch can change private rights and obligations before the judicial branch has said that this is actually lawful to do this, it's an outrage that I think we've all just gotten used to, and it's well within the capacity of the president to tell his regulators that the effective date of your rules has to be after we have a final decision from the judicial branch.
Chris?
So that everybody knows that this is a legal rule before people start complying with it, and to take away from the agencies this technique that they do very, very well of telling their stakeholders that, well, we're going to argue about this in court, but here's the effective date, and of course we're expecting everybody who's really part of the team here at OSHA to comply with these things in advance, which has the effect of mooting a lot of what the courts do.
Chris, we're going to have to.
Am I through?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
So there are two reasons I always like to be on a panel with Jim Tosey. The first is, that means I won't be the oldest person on the panel. The second is, he always leads us in the right direction to find the right answer to very important questions. And so in his paper, he notes, as both he and Chris mentioned in their oral presentations, that the justification for a regulatory budget is primarily opportunity cost of capital. The concern is that if we really force investments by third parties, regulated firms, then that's committing resources to something, and if we could commit those same resources to something else and get a better return on them. And so I looked at that and said, I think that's absolutely right. So that means the right question is not, should we have a regulatory budget, but how do we calculate the rational, economically rational ceiling? Is it, for instance, the zero incremental cost ceiling that is implied by the president's order? And so I said, okay, we've got all the data we need readily accessible to make that determination. Every year, OIRA is required to make an annual report to Congress about the relationship between the costs and the benefits of every rule that OIRA considered over the last 10 years. And the average of the ratios is 7 to 1. Okay? There are 7 times as many benefits on average as there are costs. And by the way, I went back and I took a quick look, and it doesn't vary depending on whether the rule was issued during a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. The variations are trivial. The overall number is 7 to 1. So what does that mean? That means we're getting a 600% return on our investment in regulation. So you could use that as a basis to figure out what the ceiling. Now, I'm not mandating that we immediately crank up to the ceiling level. A ceiling is only a ceiling. But that tells me we're a hell of a long way from the economic ceiling, economically rational ceiling on regulatory expenditures. It also provides an easy way of figuring out whether we're approaching it. Just look at the annual report. If and when we ever get to a ratio of 1.1 to 1, then there might be some concern, because there may be investments out there, alternative investments out there, that would pay better than a 10% return. But as long as we're talking about 600% return, I'm not worried about us being anywhere near the economically rational ceiling on any regulatory budget. Now, both Jim and Chris and every other advocate of regulatory budgets is real quick to point out that we don't have regulatory budgets in the appropriation context. True, we also don't have cost-benefit analysis. In fact, we don't have cost-benefit analysis in anything involving fiscal policy. We make decisions all the time to add or subtract taxes and to add or subtract appropriations, massive numbers, without doing any cost-benefit analysis at all. I wish we did cost-benefit analysis on it. I think it would look very, very different from what we have today. We have this little thing called a $1 trillion annual deficit. If you're like me, you have trouble wrapping your mind around $1 trillion. I've never had $1 trillion, but let me see if I can translate this. This is primarily a function of 2 things. Tax cuts for super rich people, I'm one of them, and massive benefits for entitlement benefits for middle-class people. So let me translate this into a particular situation. Me, okay? I won't tell you exactly what I make, but I'm massively overpaid, okay? And then I have income from other sources. And then I get $40,000 a year from Social Security. And then the most recent tax cut gave me another $23,000 in disposable income. So thank you very much. You guys just made an investment in me of an additional $63,000 a year. Yeah, I appreciate that. So what am I doing with that to provide social benefits? Well, I love traveling to places like Antarctica and Africa. That's what I'm using it for. Okay, so I thank you. The government of Botswana thanks you. National Geographic and Lindblad thank you. But I think you're nuts. And what I would love to see is somebody sit down and do some cost-benefit analysis of both tax decisions and spending decisions, and I'm betting you we would not have $1 trillion deficit. And if there's a problem of waste of scarce capital that could be put to better uses, it's fiscal policy where we should be looking, not regulatory policy. Thank you.
So, Jim, do you want to amend your paper to add?
I'm just going to be quiet.
Okay. All right. Well, I'd just like to allow Jim and Anthony and Chris time potentially to respond to anything that any of the other panelists said, and obviously Professor Pierce as well. But I do have a first question before we go to the audience, which is if you all could talk a little bit more about boundedness. I thought that was very interesting. So, of course, the managerial difficulty is setting boundedness, and what Administrator Ray mentioned, the first thing that he asked of the administration was he needed political support when he was going toe-to-toe with the principals in other agencies. And we have all of these examples of you come up with a cost benefit, you come up with a number, and someone gets an exception. And I know, Anthony, you mentioned that every agency came into compliance. I'm just kind of curious for all the panelists, is our system, I think I know the answer to this, but is our system actually bounded when we're talking about reg budgets? How do you make it more bounded?
Well, first let's get to boundedness. Chris said that the dystopian at Yale did this. First of all, the point is, some people think of regulatory budgets and it's just we're adding numbers up and we're putting them in the columns and drawing lines. There's a big, long theoretical development over many years of optimization of, if you want to go to national efficiency and how you do that. And the point that I made, I want when you read that stuff, you talk about nerdy stuff as nerd. But there's a whole body of thought that shows over a number of mathematical and a lot of other thoughts that if you're going to allocate resources, and economics is the allocation of scarce resources, that if you make those decisions under a bounded institution, that national efficiency comes up higher. And so the points that have been made is that now we do not have a regulatory budget per se in that way because we're in the in the infancy of the regulatory budget. Because what we said, or I didn't say, I don't say anything anymore. What they said was a regulatory budget of 0. Okay, and so that regulatory budget of 0, the optimization there is that you just don't go over the top. So there's no optimization per se in terms of all the things I said. So if you look at an earlier one, the one that was developed by the Carter administration, and people asked us to do, what do you call it, 2 in, 1 out, but we had a problem with the offsets because there was a big fight with the lawyers. They said there was a little bump in the road called the APA, so we took it out. But in that one there, we set actual targets for each agency that they could have. So so I can't say the current one is bounded. It's bounded to this extent, though. It's bounded by a 0, okay, which is a unique bound, okay.
And I guess, at the outset of the administration, coming up with those numbers for each agency is a difficult task. I mean, that is something that was considered, extensively. And do you sort of just pick numbers? What do you do? Do you take 25% of the stock over the last few years? I mean, how do you decide what that ought to be? And so, to sort of focus the mind and have everyone working toward the same thing, it's, as you say, it's not perfectly bounded. It's not exactly a regulatory budget, but setting that $0 clear goal out in front of everyone, and with a long guidance document written by OIRA providing for a number of accommodations and features that are useful for the proper implementation of the program to account for some of the things you talked about. I think that was very useful in this case. In future years, as you saw sort of at the beginning, the 0 was the number, but then we left the flexibility for the subsequent years to set it and adjust it based on things once we were able to get in and work on the individual agencies and see what they think is likely and what is possible, given the flexibilities that they have within their regulatory frameworks under statute and those sorts of things. So it's not perfect and precise, but I think for an initial experiment in this area, I think it was quite useful.
One other thing, I think Richard hit the hardest point in a regulatory budget. How do you set the totals? And there's very little theoretical work, and even if you use all the things of optimal theory of delegation and everything on the books, I don't know of any easy answer to answer what Richard said is how you set that total. And you can, there's some ways you can do it, but that is a very important problem, and I can't give you the answer to that. Chris?
Actually, there is an answer. And the answer is that the bound is exogenous. It is random. And in the kind of budgeting that we know in the expenditure side of what the government does, Congress gives you a number, and it's politically determined. How much are we going to spend on national defense versus food stamps versus bridges versus NIH research? Well, there's some history, there's political pressures, but it's essentially, we don't worry about the bound because it's just those guys on Capitol Hill, they figure it out. And we work with that. For the executive branch to do it through a sort of some formal rationalized program, it's very, very it's very hard to do because it's inherently arbitrary. Now, Dick would say, no, it's not. The budget is, you keep not only may you, but you should keep adding regulations until we get 1-to-1 ratios in the benefit cost standards that you're setting to us. That would be a sort of rationalized idea, but that's not much of a bound, and in almost all of the principal agent literature, the principal knows the bound, and then the agent lives within it.
I wish the budgeting process worked that way. It doesn't. The largest sums in the budget are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Which
and
are
nobody
unbudgeted.
looks at them. They're off budget.
Right.
Congress does not look at them at all. Congress will not touch them. The president will not touch them.
Which is what you want for regulation, unbounded.
Oh, no, I'd have a boundary. And I think we're way beyond the boundary that should apply to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, but nobody will touch those. I think we're talking nickels and dimes versus hundreds of billions. Somebody needs to address entitlements. I should not be getting $40,000 a year of your money.
Richard, I worked for 5 presidential administrations and looked at another 5, and I've never found one administration that wanted to take on entitlements of either party. Right. It is untouchable. And if you go to that article I wrote, and there's those footnotes, go to there's one called Giveth and Taketh. And I used to work in the budget side for years, and I said, I wonder if there's a way you can really control these entitlement programs. And I was writing all mathematical games and stuff, and I just couldn't get any of the game theory to give me a game theoretic solution where you could actually ever come with a socially acceptable way to balance the budget, to do entitlement program. Always got the null set in the vectors, okay? So I said, well, I'm giving up on working on budgets. I'll go on working. Because taketh programs you might control, but giveth programs you'll never control. And I think, Richard, I don't know if anyone's going to address that problem.
Well, we can go to the audience for questions now. Do we have someone with a mic floating around? Okay, I think there's mics on the side. And if you could hand one down to the front right here. Thanks.
Sure. So this comment's primarily for Professor Pierce. I share your your passion for considering the opportunity cost of capital. And I think that, to the Trump administration's credit, they have stopped issuing those annual OMB reports to Congress. And one of the reasons why that's a good thing is precisely because they tend to ignore the opportunity cost of capital. And this isn't widely known even among a lot of economists, but if you ask experts on cost-benefit analysis, they'll tell you that the proper way to account for the opportunity cost of capital is to adjust the value of capital-related benefits and costs with a shadow price. It's not, for example, to use like a discount rate, which is the common approach, but that's actually wrong. And if you ask experts, even experts at OIRA, they will tell you that that's the wrong approach. And so the end result is essentially that opportunity cost is simply ignored. And so we have big benefits and we have costs, and we're not considering the fact that those costs could be invested and would grow into something in value in the future. By contrast, something like a zero cost cap forces consideration of the opportunity cost of capital. It forces consideration of economic efficiency because it demands essentially that the rate of return to capital be positive. And so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, I guess as to your first point, do you actually believe that if you made the calculation right, we'd come up with reports that the costs exceed the benefits? I mean, we were talking about 7-to-1 ratios. It takes a hell of a big math error to explain a 7-to-1 ratio.
If the discount rate is fairly low, you get a very big number. I think we should use a low discount rate. So it could easily be 10, 20, 50 times costs more. Depends what it's.
The cost would be 10 to 50 times more?
Yes.
I'd love to see that calculation on paper.
Shadow price formula.
Well, I'm from Missouri. I want to see it.
Well, let's get to the other point about, if you ask some people in OIRA about those annual reports that you're talking about, Richard, it's a question how accurate they are. Those numbers, unless Susan knows more recent than I, those numbers were generated by the agencies and never reviewed by OMB. OMB just sort of stapled them together and added them up. So as far as I know, those large numbers in there was never any quality control on them. And I don't know if that's still right, but it wasn't for a number of years. So I think those are very high numbers, and they might be accurate, but I think that it may need subject to some other review.
This actually leads me to a bigger concern, and it's something that Sally Casson raised this morning, and Stuart also referred to it. What I'm now hearing is CBA is crap. You get all the wrong numbers, okay? Or, to put it another way, the way the Obama administration did it, massively inflated benefits. Or, in Stuart's view, the way this administration is doing it, it's all wrong the other way. And if that is the prevailing view, cost-benefit analysis is dead, and it ought to be dead. Now, I don't believe that. I believe there is something to it. I believe that while there are certainly margins for error, and we should never be looking at pinpoint numbers, we should be looking at ranges of numbers and understand that there's a big area of uncertainty on both the cost side and the, but if the public gets the impression, as I increasingly hear they might from people in this group, that this is crap because a Republican will come up with this set of numbers, a Democrat with this set of numbers. No decisional tool is useful if it is that pliable.
So Susan in the front.
So let me just address that part. I think benefit cost analysis can be manipulated. It's very uncertain, and the assumptions that go into it matter a lot in what you get for outcomes. Chris this morning talked about the fine particles. Those benefits from reducing those comprise, I think, about 80% of all the benefits that you're talking about. Just a few assumptions would change those to zero, because they don't know what the causal link is. So if you find out, actually, indeed, this is not causal, that would drop to zero, and then I think you do very quickly get costs that are much more than the benefits.
Well, I just had occasion, I've always been a little concerned about the six-city study, which, as you know, is the sole basis, was initially the sole basis for that. And so I just read a 400-page book about the subsequent studies and how they relate to the six-city study. It's a fascinating read, and even though the folks who did the six-city study, that's the basis for this number, is the number they came up with, the Harvard researchers, even though they were unwilling to hand over their working papers, and I think that was pretty bad, and they should have been required to do so. What we have since then is a dozen studies that they don't come exactly the same, but they corroborate. They're consistent with the six-city study. So now, there wasn't very strong support for it at the initial time that EPA relied on it. Today, there's pretty strong support for it. Turns out small particulate matters kill a lot of people.
Well, the distinction between correlation or association and causation is important there, and I think there's still very big questions about the validity of those estimates, and that does drive the benefits.
But we're back to
So if it's true under yours, then every other agency should stop regulating at all.
So 80%
all our
of this is
regulations
crap?
should be
80% of this is something that one person can say it's there, and one person, if you really believe that, then I don't see how you can continue to defend a mechanism that I find a very valuable tool and always thought was a valuable tool. If 80% of it can disappear based on, well, it's uncertain, so maybe it's zero, maybe it's tens of thousands of deaths, then...
This gets to the principal agent problem, because I don't think benefit cost analysis is crap and that it should be ignored. But I do think that some of the things that we're talking about forces us to think more about the opportunity costs, and can we use money in a better way and get more lives saved. And so I think that's what we're talking about, some kind of constraint that forces that, rather than a rule of thumb that just says, as long as we can show there are benefits, let's use it without looking at how else that money might have been spent.
Is it on this issue? Okay, well then, so we can go to Rosika right there, and then we'll go to the back next. We got time.
Hi, so I just wanted to add on that last point. Even if we all think that there's some kind of range when it comes to cost-benefit analysis, I don't think the conclusion is to get rid of it. I actually will offer a different normative view, which is that a commitment to cost-benefit analysis, and then say some reliance on studies that maybe it's correlation, not causation. But as long as we have that commitment in place, that should create the incentives for anyone who disagrees to produce better studies and keep looking into these issues, because I think we do want to know ultimately if particulate matter causes or doesn't, right? So then you have this incentive to keep doing this analysis, and it gets better over time. At least that's the hope. We talked about a lot of other things that can incentivize this kind of continuing improvement over the analysis, retrospective review for sure, as Sally and Susan both mentioned in the beginning panel, et cetera. So I just want to make that point that still having that in place, that commitment in place, drives the incentives to make it better. But I wanted to just, and then make a small little point about the regulatory budget, because the budget is important. So the assumption, so I guess the problem here is that you're doing cost-benefit analysis, and maybe the agency is overvaluing the benefits relative to what society thinks, say. So that's why when Richard looks at OMB, that doesn't give us quite the answer, because maybe they're overvaluing it. Okay. So the budget creates some internal pressure to do the prioritization that we want them to do, and then the answer should come out aligned with what society would actually want, because they'll pick the best ones first. even if they're overvaluing it, subject to constraint, they will pick the same policies. And Yair talks about that, and also the whole optimization literature focuses on this. But to make it actually net beneficial for society, you do have to think about, are you setting the budget at the right level? So I think that is a very important point. Now, we can say it's exogenous, that's fine, I guess. And I guess the theory is you elect a president, and the president sets, well, this is what society thinks is the value. But if this becomes the overlay over cost-benefit analysis going forward, I think that's a key important decision that should be transparent and discussed, et cetera, because I think that changes, that's the key, that ends up deciding whether we're going to be net beneficial for society.
So we can go to the back if you have. It's all very Hegelian. All right.
Jamie Conrad, this whole discussion of regulatory budgets proceeds on the assumption that agencies are the sources of regulation, that they impose regulations and they impose costs, sort of acting on their own. Agencies are the creatures of statute. Agencies can only do the things that Congress has authorized them to do. Most of the regulations we're talking about are things Congress has instructed them to do. A regulatory budget concept that focuses on agencies, I think, has the moral hazard that it allows Congress and members of Congress to stand up and take credit for having done wonderful things, and then turn around and blame the agencies for imposing these terrible costs on people that are only the ones Congress imposed. So it seems to me, and I'm interested in folks' thoughts, that the more morally useful approach would be to have a requirement, maybe a point of order that says that no statute can be taken up on no bill can be taken up on the floor that authorizes regulations that doesn't include in that authorization a budget that tells the agency the amount of cost that they're allowed to impose on the public in the course of implementing that regulation, because then Congress becomes accountable for the costs that are imposed. Then all you're dealing with agencies is how efficiently they're doing it, and that's what OIRA does just fine now. But the idea of the regulatory budget seems to me needs to be on Congress, or else you're just creating a kind of morality play.
I'm the last one to know anything about a morality play, but I would say this, Jimmy, that is one way to get the Congress involved. When Chris says it was to be a exogenous input, that's one mechanism of doing that.
And I would just add that one reason I think it is useful to focus on agencies, you may also focus on Congress, but is because especially as Congress passes fewer and fewer bills, there's still problems out in the world. Agencies want to address those problems, and as you will note, the very substantial percentage of the regulatory activity is pursuant to broad grants of discretion to agencies and not mandated, recently passed legislation requiring a certain change. A substantial portion is just purely discretionary from statutes passed 50 years ago. And so in that context, I think it does make sense to make sure that to the extent agencies are exercising discretion, they're exercising it in a manner consistent with the requirements of cost-benefit analysis and the policy preferences of the president, in whom the executive authority is vested under the Constitution.
Yes, I was kind of thinking another way to get at the problem is to have every regulation originate in the House, right? So we have it seems like there are those here that seem to think that cost-benefit analysis is about getting to the truth, and those that kind of think that it's more of a decision-making process. And I guess to kind of synthesize the comments of the panelists, would there be any benefit, just to kind of put a point on a question that was sort of asked but not quite answered before, would there be any benefit to reg budgets if we admitted that there was a lot of gaming, if we just accepted that as a fact of life, that the data quality is going to be very low? Is there still some sort of democratic or some other value that you get out of a reg budget?
Oh, yes. I think the important thing about a reg budget is that as I said, benefit cost analysis of net benefits positive is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition for getting into the regulatory budget. That's point one. Point two is the analysis that you do then on a regulatory budget of X particular rules, they're in competition with each other. They're not in competition with some metric. And the type of analysis you do is like the kind you do on the budget side of OMB. You compare different programs. And so when you have to compare, not against a metric, you have to compare this program or this rule specifically with this. It cleans, it gives a big incentive to take out a lot of the flexibility you say it's in. So no, I think they're very compatible. I think a regulatory budget would be a way to improve what you call flexibility in the regulatory.
Jim, do you think the comparison should include with the appropriations and tax cuts? That somebody should sit down and say, okay, what's the net benefits of this appropriation versus this regulation versus this reduction in taxes?
I think that would be first, I can't argue with it theoretically, no. I think that would be a way off because on tax, when I was there, when I was on the budget side, the kind of analysis done on tax, and we would analyze the outlays and stuff, but actually what you call the benefits, I didn't see much of that. So I think what you said would be a long-term plan. I would just settle right now with the regs coming into that. And I want to reiterate, not that benefit cost analysis isn't strong. It's that that's a necessary but not sufficient condition to get in. Once you're in, the analysis changes in comparison to two projects. So, but Richard, to answer your answer, I think that would be a way off. I think that's a big job.
And Andrew, as to the question of you mentioned, gaming in the budget context. I think one of the most important things to us was transparency of the assumptions. Susan mentioned the importance of assumptions and the great fluctuations that might flow based on changes in assumptions. What we tried to do in the guidance on the 13771 is provide very clearly for everyone in I think some 40 Q&As on how OIRA thinks about these things. It's a set of assumptions. How are we going to approach? Now, of course, there are lots of outs and pressure valves in there, but a lot of the assumptions about the framework itself are clear, and then of course within each action they should be clear in the RIAs. But I think that's useful to monitor and manage any efforts to game system.
Well, please join me in thanking our panelists.